in battle, in forest, at the precipice in the mountains, on the dark great sea, in the midst of javelins and arrows, in sleep, in confusion, in the depths of shame. The good deeds a man has done before, defend him. So, Rob, who was that?
Well, I'm sure you're going to tell me.
I am indeed. And in fact, he's the subject of today's podcast, Robert J. Oppenheimer, no less. Couldn't you tell by the quote at the beginning?
I could.
A brilliant scientist, no doubt, but one who was moved by many things. Apart from cold, hard logic, he seemed to earn in equal measure the adoration and jealousy of his fellow scientists. But we'll go into Oppenheimer later, Rob.
Excellent, excellent. Anyway, welcome to episode 1 of The Art of Marketing Science. Episode 1. Are scientists human? So welcome to episode 1 of The Art of Marketing Science, where we try to uncover, discuss, unpack even, the subtle art of marketing in the scientific arena. I'm Dr. Robert England, and I'm joined by my co-host, Julian Stubbs. Now, I'm a scientist, and Julian is not.
Yeah, well, thanks for pointing that out, Rob. Yes, I'm no scientist, but it seems like I've spent half my life talking to scientists, so it's kind of in my blood. But you're a real scientist, or as I call you, a FUD, PhD. And I think a very unique one, as few scientists I've met are equally good scientists and good marketeers. But you are one, so you're very, very special. Now, I've been involved with strategic campaigns and branding and market research, increasingly these days, obviously, content marketing, marketing automation and product naming. So I've really been embedded in marketing to scientists. But when and how did you get involved in science, Rob?
Oh, thank you, Julian. Well, I was a pretty good writer when I was a kid. My English teacher was actually, though, confused why I would choose science. And I told him that I thought I could get a better job. He couldn't disagree with me on that, but maybe it really wasn't my calling. So eventually I won a scholarship to do a PhD, but at my very first presentation of my research to a group of scientists, the chairman of the meeting said, rather wryly, "That's very interesting, Dr. England, but where could I buy one of those?" And to everybody laughing at me. So that was a pretty strong signal to me that my talents might be better applied to marketing and sales. But Julian, did you ever enjoy science? When did you get involved with it?
Well, I have to say, science for me at school was a bit of a black hole. So stuff went into my head and then didn't emerge ever again. And to be honest, the greater fascination in science class for me as a young school pupil was not science, but the not very secret affair going on between the head of science, we'll call him Mr. T, and the head of chemistry, Mrs. H, and what was going on behind the Bunsen burners. And there was a bit of passion.
Oh, a bit of chemistry between them.
Bit of chemistry.
Nothing like a bit of passion. But when did you really get into science then?
Well, actually, it was fairly early on in my career in Uppsala, your hometown.
Oh, it is, yeah.
Of all places. And I was a young account exec, and I sat in a room with a bunch of biotech eggheads I'd asked them to explain why their particular whiz-bang product was so special. And after an hour of them talking, I realised scientists might be brilliant at what they do, but they quite often crap communicators. And so actually it taught me not to be intimidated by scientists. And so really I found my role within science, which is obviously the marketing side. And what it taught me was never to be intimidated by scientists. And eventually I was actually recruited to a life science company called Pharmacia Biotech.
Oh, yes. We all remember Pharmacia Biotech. I remember seeing one of your ads in Science magazine for the first time, and I was quite impressed by it. I didn't know you at the time. But they were very huge. Pharmacia Biotech were very huge and into purification.
They certainly were. And I can tell you a little story. Have you ever heard of the system, chromatography system called ECTA?
Yes, absolutely. Been around for a long time. It was from Pharmacia Biotech, and now it's known as Cytiva.
Well, I named it.
Oh.
That was one of my jobs. I was recruited by Pharmacia as head of marketing and branding. We had this new purification system coming along. I think it replaced FPLC, which was the system before it. And it was my job to create a new name. So we were repositioning the company, Pharmacia. And as most of our competitors were American, Japanese, thought, let's be Swedish. Let's be different. Let's be what we are. So we positioned Pharmacia Biotech as Swedish. And even from Uppsala, the tagline actually was Uppsala, Sweden, then in brackets, and the rest of the world.
I remember it well.
And it was really, some good stuff. We then needed a really cracking name for this new product that came along. And so, me of all people, Rob, being a Brit in those days, I came up with the Swedish word "äkta," which means...
It means real or pure.
Correct.
It's a great choice. What a great name.
Yeah.
And naming that really speaks volumes to your marketing and scientific creds, Julian.
Thank you. It was... it was days that I really enjoyed. And so, I learned a lot about science. And coming from you, Rob, I'll take it as a compliment. And we turned out some stunning human-led science marketing and probably some of the best stuff I've had the privilege to be involved in. We won awards. But coming back to this podcast, I think we should just clarify one thing before we get into today's subject, is the name, The Art of Marketing Science. So is it an art or is it a science? We've debated this.
We've talked about it many times on many trains in many different countries. And I think we've both come to the conclusion that it is an art, but supported and informed by science. You might have all the facts, all the data, all the figures, and the past research, but it still needs a human creative act to take the leap of imagination that engages other people. And I think this is a universal truth of both science and marketing. They're worth nothing without the human creative input.
Yes, and so I think we've kind of come down to it's an art supported by science and not the other way around, which very nicely brings us into the topic of today's podcast. And over the course of these sessions, we're going to be looking at how and why science is marketed and how best to get your message across to scientists.
Indeed.
But today's topic we're tackling, and the name of this episode is, Are Scientists Human?
A very, very provocative question.
Yeah. You'd think the answer's obvious. I mean, for decades, scientists have been portrayed as analytical machines in white lab coats, unemotional, purely driven by cold, hard facts. But underneath those flabby white lab coats, we suspect beat some very human hearts with frailties.
You know, I think it's true. The time that the general public became first aware of science was around the time of the Romantics, Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, in the early 1800s. And famously, Lord Byron and his friends had a competition to write the best horror story. And Mary Shelley chose scientists as the subject of her horror story. People to be feared because of their mad new powers. Dr. Frankenstein is her evil mastermind that brings people back to life with the newfangled invention of electricity. And since then, scientists have gone through generations of people considered to be either locked in their own ivory towers or scatterbrained or lunatic or, all three at the same time. Even the portrayal of the mathematician, John Nash, focused on his schizophrenia, And look at the recent portrayal of Robert Oppenheimer in the recent movie. He's still weirdly inhuman. Every portrait of a scientist is of someone who lacks emotion or has their emotion overridden by something more powerful. But Julian, in all our many years working alongside scientists, we've discovered they're profoundly human, complete with all the quirks and motivations, humour, and sometimes they're surprisingly vulnerable. They're human with a capital H. But today we want to touch on a very human scientist that you quoted at the top of this episode.
Absolutely, indeed, Rob. Robert J. Oppenheimer, who you could describe certainly as a brilliant but flawed visionary, but very much a human. Now, he was a theoretical physicist, best known, of course, as the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb. And as an aside, and I hadn't told you this, I actually met someone who was once part of that project. He was the editor of Science magazine, and he'd been on the Manhattan Project, which was really, really fascinating. Anyway, I digress. So I guess everybody has seen the brilliant Christopher Nolan film. Well, I'm also old enough to have seen the equally brilliant BBC TV miniseries, also called Oppenheimer. So kind of my interest started then. Anyway, he was born into wealth, a wealthy New York family, intellectually gifted, in fact, a genius, I think everybody would say, but emotionally complex. And like you, Dr. Rob, brilliant yet insecure, charismatic yet self-destructive. Anyway, you take up the story.
Why, thank you, Julian. He was educated at Harvard and Göttingen in Germany, and he became a leading figure in quantum mechanics. He was deeply cultured, fluent in multiple languages, and he captivated by philosophy and poetry. However, he was also known for his arrogance, mood swings, and occasional cruelty towards colleagues.
Again, a bit like you, Rob.
Yes, thank you very much. I think. Seriously, he had huge talents, and I won't dream of being compared to him. I mean, just take, for example, his incredible literary knowledge. He was able to quote Hindu. He could even read Sanskrit. A real Renaissance man. But I think on top of that, his amazing ability to persuade and cajole and flatter all these diva scientists who were involved in the Manhattan projects, who may have had really well-trained brains, but they hadn't any experience in cooperating with each other. And I think in many respects that many people think that the Manhattan Project would never have been successful without Oppenheimer. And then don't forget his ability to negotiate really unknown terrain for a scientist, the American military-industrial complex. That's about as far from science as you can get. He was a very fast learner, knowing how to utilize that system to his own benefit.
What a project to be engaged in. Obviously a brilliant scientist, but as you said, it was very much his human skills that they employed him for, to actually manage the other egos.
Yeah.
So that tells you a lot about science. Anyway, during World War II, as we all know, he led the secretive Los Alamos laboratory, assembling a team of the world's greatest scientists. His leadership was pretty remarkable. He was inspiring, decisive, possessed this uncanny ability to unify those huge scientific egos. And
that's as human as it gets.
It's pretty obvious. His job was about controlling those big egos.
Yeah. And then there was his moral struggle with the bomb's consequences, and became evident, especially when he started, famously, he quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am death, the destroyer of worlds."
Famous quote.
After the war, Oppenheimer became a key advisor on nuclear policy in the US, opposing the hydrogen bomb's development. And this, along with the past communist associations in his affairs, he was a ladies' man, particularly with his affair with Jean Tatlock, it suggests a certain amount of vanity and human frailty and hardly cold logic, which led to his downfall. In 1954, he was stripped of his security clearance, famously made in that film that we saw recently, in a highly publicized hearing, humiliated by Cold War paranoia and rivals like Edward Teller. But despite this, his legacy has endured. In his final years, he focused on science and philosophy before dying of cancer in 1967. Oppenheimer remains a tragic figure, but an unparalleled intellect, burdened by ambition, guilt, and political betrayal, but deeply human and driven by an ego the size of New Mexico.
So what a great example, I think, Rob, of our human scientist. So we've discussed Oppie a fair bit, but in the spirit of evidence-based research, let's bring in some other pieces of evidence in our hypothesis that scientists are actually very, very human and emotional creatures. And so I've had another interesting character that I've met, a Nobel Prize winner, no less.
Yeah, I like this one.
Yeah. I actually had the pleasure of, a number of years ago, speaking with a Nobel Prize winner for chemistry in 1993, Kerry Mullis, no less, the inventor of polymerase chain reaction, or PCR.
You got to speak with Carrie Mullis.
I did.
Oh,
I
that's
did.
cool.
I did. And so this was with Pharmacy Biotech, we were launching a direct marketing program, and we called it BioDirect. And for the first edition, we felt a superstar scientist to go on the front cover, to pull in all those scientists, because we knew scientists related to other scientists.
Sure.
Very human. And, right out of the consumer marketing playbook, basically. And so we decided Kerry Mullis was the guy, because he was the hot ticket at that point. So I was given the job of all people of ringing him up, and I had actually a huge budget to give him. To ring him up, I tracked him down after many calls to a beach, and he was a keen surfer. And eventually we scheduled a call. He came off the beach, and I rang him up, and I told him what we were going to do, and I told him we wanted to photograph him and stick him on the front cover. And he just said, "Yeah, I'll do it, man." He said, just send me the check. And I mean, that was about it. And practical, honest, and very human, but emotional. And I also know he had a very strong relationship to hallucinogens, such as LSD.
Yeah, I bet he did. I bet that sounds like a Californian. Absolutely. That's hilarious, Julian.
Yeah.
What a human reaction from him. And actually, on the subject of LSD, I'd love to do a story about the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann and his discovery of LSD and his self-experimentation.
We've discussed it. It's a great story.
Yeah, we must cover that, I think, in a future episode.
Future episode. So we can talk about the Beatles there, of course, as well, our favourite subject.
Yes, of course. Yeah, the Beatles. And, if you're going to talk about the Beatles, I'm going to talk about Bowie, David Bowie. That's my house god. Anyway, getting back to the main subject of today, it's important to generally understand people's motivations. In science and in marketing, it's all the same. Motivations are really important. And I explored this in a recent article I wrote called Breaking Through to Other Minds. I traveled to Rome recently, and I met people that they were extraordinary. I'd never met people like these before. They were so different to me. There's one person I met outside the Vatican, was very religious, and she was convinced that she just experienced a miracle. She was totally, it's as strong a fact as if she was standing in front of me. And then there's this extraordinary meeting I had between a Romanian, an Italian, a Swede, and an Englishman.
It's a joke.
No, it's not a joke. It's actually happened.
Okay.
No. Anyway, it's so clear we had completely different stories and viewpoints, life perspectives. And what I found from this is that as long as you stay curious, not threatened or closed-minded to people, that's when you can really connect. And I think this is really central. This is a central truth to understanding brands and marketing. You avoid relying on those tired, prejudiced stereotypes. Their motivations might be very different from yours, but they are more related to their human nature than to any fictional quirk of being a scientist.
So I think a very, very good point when it comes to scientists, and don't sort of believe in stereotypes of what scientists are. And curiosity is the key, and it's a powerful thing, not just in science, but in branding and communications. And I know you've got your own Nobel Prize anecdote as well, Rob.
Yeah, this is quite interesting. My first days in Sweden, I was asked by the professor who was running our business at the time to call up a renowned microscopist to make a presentation in Stockholm. And this particular scientist, he was actually a candidate for the Nobel Prize, but I had to keep that a secret from him. It was completely under wraps about his candidature. And because it wasn't all public information, I was racking my brains how to get his attention because he wouldn't call me back. Then I got it. I left him a message. I informed him that the invitation had come through me, by the way, from a newly inaugurated member of the Nobel Committee. Guess what? He immediately called me back. A very human reaction, motivated by, his need for recognition, coming to Stockholm for a reason, prestige, perhaps a little bit of ambition.
Very human. So let's throw some more evidence in to support our theory of the human scientist. And I've conducted a fair few focus groups in my time with scientists in Europe, US, even Japan, which is actually always difficult with market research. And you learn so much in these sessions. And I've done tons of them, and it's not always what people say. Quite often it's what they don't say. And then you have to work out how to really drag it out of them, pull it out of them, what's really motivating them. And that's similar to whether it's scientists or consumers. So you have to do the same thing. But I remember one session in New Jersey in a place called Fort Lee, just over the George Washington Bridge. And we had a group of scientists in the room, maybe 10 or 12 scientists, and they'd all bought this very expensive bit of scientific kit in their lab. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars worth. And to be honest, they were slagging it off. They'd all bought it. Yeah. And we were sat behind the class, me and a couple of colleagues, trying to work out, well, why the hell did they buy it? They weren't happy about the service. It was difficult. The performance wasn't always great. There were competitors at a lower price point and all this stuff. And then eventually one guy at the end, who'd been very quiet, sort of said, I bought it because it is the most expensive piece of kit in this business. And I wanted everybody to know I was, and he didn't use these words, but basically he was saying, top dog. Other scientists would see my lab, see this piece of kit, and they'd know I got the grant, I got the money, the funding to buy it. And that's as a human motivation as you can get from a top scientist. So, ambition, that's probably what it is. And ambition isn't so bad. It's very human. Anyway, Rob, more evidence, please. I mean, your Swedish professor, the keynote, that was a nice story.
Yeah, he was a professor that invited me to do my first research in Sweden, in Uppsala. And basically, when I returned to England, I wanted to reciprocate the favour to him. So I invited him to hold a keynote speech at a British symposium. And he made quite the entrance. This is the first time he was speaking in Britain. He was standing in front of this audience of his British scientific peers. And his opening line was, "You can take all your research and throw it in the waste paper basket."
He was Chinese.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
Very bold, very abrasive.
Yes.
You could see the backs of every member of the audience stiffening, I literally had my head in my hands. But beneath his bravado was a human fear of vulnerability, of being exposed, and perhaps a deep desire to gain their respect and, to connect to a group that had long ostracized him. So scientists, are they human? I think we know that they are very, very human creatures, very much open to human emotions. And when it comes to decision making...
Well, I think exactly the point. And not decrying the use of hard facts. They'll always be important in all purchases. But motivations are still very much driven by human emotions and needs on all levels. And to be valued and to be understood. And I mean, it's true of music, marketing, science, in fact, everywhere. And talking of music, and I don't think we could do this podcast without bringing in music, because you and I love music.
We do.
I think a couple of music-inspired thoughts to pass on that relate to being a great marketer. So I'm going to kick off with my favourite band, the Beatles.
Oh, you're joking.
The Beatles. Okay. So let's go back to 1963, before they were famous. In late 62, they'd actually had a record out, a single, 45, Love Me Do.
Oh, yeah.
Peaked at number 17. And they were all a bit disappointed. They thought they were onto a winner. So their producer, George Martin, in Abbey Road, said, "Boys, I've got this great new record of script and lyric and song called How Do You Do It? And I think it's going to be number one. You'll get your first number one, boys, with this new song." Yeah. And so they recorded it. I've listened to the recording. You can play it on Spotify. Actually,
Jerry and the Pacemakers, right? They did it.
The Beatles said, "No, we're not going to do it." And George Martin was also producing Jerry and the Pacemakers, so he gave it to them, and it went to number one. Oh. So they kind of missed out on their number one, but they held, to their principles. And one of the things was they didn't think it was good enough for the Beatles. Not getting to number one, but good enough for the Beatles, which is very important. They didn't think it fitted their style. And they held out and they hung on for their own hit, eventually getting their own hit with From Me to You, which went to number one. And they'd written it, which was very important for them. And so, Jerry and the Pacemakers, good group. The Beatles, a great group. And so I think there's a lesson in that, sort of stick to your principles and just don't jump at a gimmick. And that's the same in marketing.
That's very interesting. And that actually relates to a favourite story of mine about my favourite artist, David Bowie.
David Bowie.
He's got a similar story, and actually it relates to what you're talking about, which is, how to recognise your authentic brand. And I think many people know it, but maybe some people don't. Bowie spent 10 years wandering the desert, the wilderness, trying to find fame. Okay, more than anything else, he desired fame. He tried loads of things. He was like in a Zen Buddhist arts lab in Beckenham, a theatre mime artist, London R&B band frontman. He was a jolly Cockney vaudeville singer, Mark Bolan rocker, even a gimmick as the founder of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Long-Haired Men. He tried anything and everything to get attention, right? But it was only when, I think, this is my theory, it was only when he joined together the two things that were authentically Bowie, which is his fascination with alienation of otherworldly isolation, plus his amazing storytelling talent to create a persona. And he did that first with Major Tom, who was in Space Oddity, and later Ziggy Stardust. They were both born. And they're the same idea of isolation, alienation, and this person. And that's when he really took off, because that was really where his authentic talent was. So, that's what we all got to find when we try to find our brands. What is authentically us? Well, that's central to making your own brand, be it a company or being at the individual level. So you've got to be authentic. You've got to be brave. That's what I've learned over the years. You've got to turn down doing the wrong thing. It's a great marketing lesson for all brands and even for all scientists.
Exactly. And then discovering what is truly authentic is absolutely essential and central to creating a strong brand. You've got to know the DNA of the company, the product, and the scientist.
Yeah, you really got to dig deep to find, what is really authentic. This reminds me of a scientist who'd recently established a new lab, once again in Sweden. He bought some really expensive microscopes from me. And initially I was actually surprised that all his attention was actually on the room that he was designing to put the microscopes in, He had electronic doors with a personal key card access and automatic lighting that turned on when the door swung open that highlighted these really expensive kit. And at first glance, it seemed to be driven by his ego. But the more we spoke, it became clear to me that what was actually driving him was something deeper. He genuinely wanted the space to reflect his own excitement and wonder that he felt for the research and the discoveries he was making. And he wanted to create a sense of inspiration and wonder for everyone who was visiting him. He wanted to share that with people.
Which brings us back to our point that scientists are very, very human and deeply curious, emotional, and yes, sometimes wonderfully eccentric and highly emotional people. Understanding that humanity is what helps marketeers truly connect.
And I guess that's the message that you'll be bringing to SAMPS in Europe, 2025 in Cambridge, UK, Julian? And actually, what is SAMPS?
So SAMPS is, an excellent association for sales and marketing professionals in science. Previously, it was called the ACPLS. And we were members, and I said, for the life of me, I can never remember the acronym, and I don't think anybody else can.
No.
So we all decided we needed to rename it, and I was lucky enough to be the one chosen to name it. So I named it SAMPS, Sales and Marketing Professionals in Science.
It's not like Samson, or what do you think?
No, SAMPS, Sales and Marketing Professionals in Science. So a bit easier. That was 7 or 8 years ago. But anyway, they hold meetings in Europe and the US, and I'll be after dinner speaker at their event in Cambridge in the UK on April 3rd, which will be great. It'll be a bit of fun. So if you're in life science and marketing, join SAMPS and join us in Cambridge.
So Julian, what will we be covering in your speech?
So I'll be talking a little bit about what I've learned about marketing to scientists over the last number of years. And as we've been discussing, it's not always about the facts and the cold, hard science, but you have to have the right emotional appeals as well. So, I mean, it should be a fun speech.
That's going to be really interesting. Beautifully said. Marketing science isn't just about science. It's about making the right emotional appeals as well to align with the particular scientific persona that you're trying to influence.
Exactly. Perhaps it's finally time we retire this robotic scientist cliche.
Oh, God, absolutely, Julian. If I see another science ad with a white lab coat, I'll throw up. So it's long overdue.
So what will we focus on next time, Dr. Rob?
That's a good question. Actually, we mentioned I absolutely love the story of
Yeah.
Albert Hoffman, the Swiss chemist working at Sandoz Laboratories.
I'll never forget, you told me that story in Switzerland
Yeah.
on a train.
Yeah, we were in Basel, weren't
Yeah.
we? And the extremely weird story of his discovery of LSD, weirder than the drug itself, I'd say. And what a story of cultural change that follows it, Then you've got Timothy Leary, turn on, tune in, drop out. Talk about a great tagline, The merry pranksters, the flower power people of the hippie revolution, even the invention of the personal computer.
Yep.
Anyway, hope you enjoyed this first edition of The Art of Marketing Science. And if you did enjoy it, please do sign up for the next episode. But until then, stay wise, stay curious, and above all, stay human.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
The Art of Marketing Science is produced by UpThereEverywhere.com. The next edition will be available shortly.